Hello and welcome to the Pedagogy Podcast, the podcast that aims to bridge the gap between teaching, coaching and all things pedagogy. This week I am joined by Dan Williams. Dan is a programme leader and senior lecturer at the University of Derby. In this episode we discussed the issues with learning styles. We looked at feedback and assessment, as well as discussing Dan's current work within his PhD regarding discourses of skill. Thank you for tuning in and I hope you enjoy the episode. So, welcome to the podcast, Dan. Thank you for joining me today. I think a good place to start would be for you to tell the listeners just a little bit more about yourself, around your background and where you're at now and the work you're doing there.
Okay, yeah. So, Dan Williams, I'm currently a programme leader and senior lecturer at the University of Derby, and I work primarily on the FE teacher training programs there. And with that, I work primarily with those that are wanting to teach sport in FE, which is my background. So prior to this role, I started teaching, 2008, I think it was. I teach sport at a college in the Midlands, and I was there for about 6 years and then progressed into like quality type roles. So I was working across a college also in the Midlands, a different one, and then I was offered the opportunity to work in another college in a quality role, but also doing a bit of their in-service teacher training, and was there for a short while, just over a year, and then the job at Derby came up, and I've been there for getting on for 6 years now, so quite a while. Prior to me joining my first college, I was always sort of sports coaching of some description. So I did a lot of swimming teaching, a bit of football coaching, a bit of multi-sports coaching. But I suppose much of my industry experience came through personal training and fitness instruction, which I did alongside my studies. So throughout my degree, I was working nearly 30 hours a week. Looking back, I have no idea how I did that, but I was working about 30 hours a week as a fitness instructor and personal trainer. And so obviously prior to the formal teaching, there was lots of coaching and instruction and things like that.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. So I guess the purpose of this podcast was I'm someone such as yourself who comes from a coaching background and then more recently into teaching, and having to understand both sides of the coin, I feel as if there are a number of bridges between the two. So the idea was to get people on such as yourself and people from also from the coaching world to discuss teaching, coaching, learning and all things pedagogy really. So I think a good place for us to start would be with learning styles. And I know from knowing you that you maybe have a couple of issues, let's say, with the term learning styles and what that means. So it'd be great really just to start there and get your thoughts on that, and potentially some of the problems with learning styles or the term learning style in general.
Okay. So first off, I suppose I'll be a bit controversial. The premise behind learning styles isn't a bad one. Let's start there. I think the whole idea of inclusion and supporting each individual learner to meet their needs is really important. So that's good. But something never quite felt right to me. So when I started teaching, we had to ask every student to complete the learning styles inventory. The questions they have, I like to read books, or I like this. And then, of course, that revealed what their preferred style of learning was, or what their learning style was. And he sort of labeled them based on that. And, you get visual, auditory, kinesthetic and whatnot. And then you had to put that into your group profile at the time. I'm not sure if they still exist in quite the same way, but it was a lengthy Word document with lots of details about the learner. So you put in there what they were, and then you'd ignore it for the rest of the year because you'd be teaching in the way that suited the content, and you'd be trying different methods to try and connect with the learners anyway. So for me, from the outset, I just was like, why am I wasting all this time getting them to fill out this pointless questionnaire, which was so dependent on how they felt that day. You know, if they'd just read it didn't often happen with sport learners, but let's say they just read a wonderful novel, they're going to come in and say, you know, I like reading. And so, yeah, it just never quite felt right. So I was sort of always interested in, you know, why did this come about, where it came from, and never got sufficient answers from colleagues at the institution, from managers, from quality teams. It was just, you need to do it because individuals, you know, that was the sort of message. And so started to then read a bit more of the literature around pedagogy full stop. But, you know, obviously it took me down a path about with learning styles, and eventually came across Cofield et al.'s work from 2004. So that was sort of a proper analysis of all the different learning styles inventories. And surprisingly, there was about 70 odd that they came across, and they did a proper investigation into 13 of what was seen as perhaps the most robust. And I mean, I can't do Cofield's work justice, but fundamentally they found that the learning styles were flawed. There was not always sort of credible methodologies behind these approaches to suggest the learning styles worked. And yeah, that sort of led me down that path of, okay, well, so why are we doing this? And I came across Pashler. I don't know if you come across Pashler's work. Pashler and colleagues, they're from America, and they did a big review of learning styles as well in I think it was 2006. Again, finding that none of the support for learning styles was grounded in sort of a credible research. It's sort of anything that was done to, you know, show that there was potentially a learning style was actually really biased. And so that sort of led me down that idea. And then when you think about pedagogy full stop, excuse me, let me just close my email so we don't get pop-ups. When you think about pedagogy, when you look at some of the work by like the Bjorks, who talk about desirable difficulties, and, you know, learning is meant to be challenging, and for it to really stick, it's got to be a challenge. And the whole idea of learning styles is that you mesh the type of instruction, the mode of learning, with what they really like, which is normally like trying to make learning easier for them. So it goes against the idea of actually learning should be quite difficult and challenging. So that's called the meshing hypothesis. I don't know if you've ever come across that term, but that idea is sort of a bit flawed when you think about it. And so, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. You have this case, this way of rambling, and so I think we just have to, you know, I think there was probably more important things that we should focus on as teachers that can have much greater impact. You know, you can look at the work of John Hattie and Visible Learning, the Education Endowment Foundation. There's things that are quite high impact strategy.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just through kind of a bit of reading of myself, really, and you look around, you might see learning styles just rebranded, you know, reframed, renamed as something like learning preferences, which I guess in principle is still just learning styles in disguise. And I mean, got a little excerpt here from a blog post of yours, really, which again I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of, instead of recycling them, let's just stick them in the trash once and for all, and focus on the stuff that works. So I guess my question for you is, what is the stuff that works? What can we be doing instead? What is the alternative to learning styles or learning preferences?
I think for me, think about individuals and their needs. If we go from that, you know, I started this podcast from that premise of meeting learners' needs and, you know, supporting them. I think if we're starting there, we need to think about what they come to us with, what knowledge they have. So focusing on the content more than anything else, not than how they learn, because largely, people might disagree with this, but we learn fundamentally in the same way. There will be differences, don't get me wrong, but let's focus on the content. We come in with lots of different knowledge. Now, there's a researcher, I think it's Carl Binder, it's only Binder, who has done a bit of work on what he calls cumulative disfluency. So the idea behind that is that if we are learning new content, so say we're learning about addition and subtraction and multiplication and division and so on, if we start trying to move on to doing higher level things, so starting to do things like fractions, without becoming fluent in the foundation aspects, we become disfluent. So what we do is that accumulates, because if we're disfluent, say in division, and then we go on to fractions and we can't do them, we can become disfluent there. It's that constantly in education, we're moving on, we're moving forward, we're progressing, and actually there might be something fundamentally in the foundations that we need to fix. Much like a house. You build a house. I'm not a house builder, but if you get the foundations wrong, there's gaps in it. There's problems later down the line as you continue to build on that. And that's what I think is more important. So actually, really, really important that we focus our attention on what do the learners know when they come to us. What can they do? And once we establish that, then we can start filling in the gaps and helping them become more fluent.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a nice little link. So you talked there about knowing what they know already. So I think if we move to looking at kind of assessment, in particular initial assessment and finding out what they do know, I know that there can be issues with poor initial assessment, or maybe poor is a strong word, but what's a better phrase to use? I don't know. Ineffective initial assessment, and kind of how problematic that can be. It would be good just to get some thoughts on that, and maybe things you see with new teachers, with in people in initial training, and maybe common issues you see, and maybe some advice for maybe overcoming those.
Okay. If I could just thank you for muting. I could hear myself. Okay, so common thing we find with trainees is that they don't do initial assessment. The students come into the classroom and they start teaching and they don't have a clue what their starting points are, and of course that's problematic because they might be going over all ground for some, they might be advancing too quickly for others, and so on. So not doing any initial assessment is obviously not a good thing. So when we talk about initial assessment, this is both at the start of a course of study. I think that's really important, getting that right, because there's different ways of viewing it. So there's right, what do they know about this? Say we're doing 12 weeks of anatomy and physiology. What do they know about that? Let's get a starting point. That's really important at the very beginning of the course, but also then at the beginning of your sessions, your learning periods, whatever you want to call them. There's got to be some sort of, well, what do you know about this bit we're talking about today? What can you recall? So in order to do that, quite often you see teachers using quizzes, which are great. Multiple choice quizzes are great, but the problems arise in the writing of the questions. And it becomes not I'm checking what you already know. It's I'm checking, can you figure out a way to the answer here? So quite often it'll be like, which of these is not the one? And then of course, it leads you. It's almost like you get double negatives in the question, which confuse people for a start. But then also things that, is it A? Capital of France A? This is a bad example. I'm not thinking this through. Anyway, it's something A, X, B, Y, C, Z, or D, all of the above. Well, normally when it's all of the above as an option, you select that because why would they put it? It's like, so you're not really assessing their knowledge, you're assessing their ability to sort of navigate these questions. And so for me, there's a lot of work that can be done in writing good multiple choice questions. And Dylan William, who does a lot of work on formative assessment, he talks a lot about something called hinge point questioning. Now, he uses that idea in the middle of lessons quite often. It's like as a hinge point to determine if they're ready to move on, which I think is really valuable. But the idea behind writing the question is also really important, I think, at the start of a session in terms of assessing where they're at. And the hinge point questions are, you do a multiple choice question and you have one correct answer, but then 3 very plausible but incorrect answers. And you use it in a way that's really quick and effective. So like, it might be, here's a multiple choice question. I'm going to ask you to show me your responses in 3, 2, 1. We count down, and you can show me your responses by either holding up ABC cards or fingers or whatever. And so you're assessing everyone. And that tends to be a really effective method if the questions are right. But of course, then, I mean, I could stem off into all sorts of areas of assessment here, but you've got things like, so you want to truly know what someone knows, you want to dig deep, don't you? You want to dig in. And so I talk a lot to my trainees about depth of assessment. So it's all well and good doing the surface stuff, which quite often your multiple choice questions do, but they don't always allow you to dig a bit deeper. So the how, the why, how does this relate to X? And so, good initial assessment will do that in some form. And I'm sort of giving examples here where it's all very much the teacher standing at the front and doing like a Q&A type thing. But of course, initial assessment can be a written essay, it can be something on paper, or it could be a demonstration. So but I think the principles still apply across the piece. And yeah, so just talking about assessment full stop, one of the things I drill into trainees right from the beginning is, when you're assessing, think about breadth, i.e. getting everyone involved. And I always use the example of catchphrase, and I'm sure you remember this, Dex. So, when we've all watched the telly show Catchphrase, and it's like, when they're in the first point, they go to that bonus round and they reveal a square, don't they? And it's like, well, revealing that one corner square, you can't see what the catchphrase is, so you can't have a good guess at what it is. But the more squares they reveal through the rounds, the more they see the picture and they can have a good stab at what it is. And I think that's the same with assessment. If you can reveal more about what your learners are thinking as you're doing your questioning and whatnot, it's like that catchphrase. We can have a good guess at, well, about 90% of them really do get this bit of content, so I can move on, or they really don't get it, so I need to reteach. So I think I talk a lot about breadth of assessment, getting coverage, but then also depth. And so it's not always possible to just get that to do a proper assessment on the surface level. We sometimes need to dig deeper, and that's where the how, why questions in, maybe peer assessment, maybe self-assessment, because actually it's not always down to the teacher to do the assessment. It can be handed over to the learners to do that. So again, me waffling there, but I hope that sort of gave you an idea of what I think good initial assessment looks like.
No, that's great. And then I guess from assessment comes then feedback. And I guess there can be a similar issue there, that ineffective feedback, we may as well not give feedback at all. So to hit you with maybe a quite a wide open question, I know we talk about things, what does good look like, modelling what good looks like, but generally speaking, how can we maximise feedback in the classroom or otherwise? Because there might be coaches listening to this who aren't in a classroom. So I think someone like yourself from a practical and a sport and a coaching background can maybe shed some light on that, and how what effective feedback looks like.
Yeah, perfect. You remind me of who might be listening to this, because if I think about effective feedback, I always think back to my days as a coach rather than my days being trained to teach. And when you learn, you're doing all your coaching badges, one of the big things they drill into you is coaching points. And that's your success criteria. And that's really important, because if you don't have success criteria, you've got nothing to hang your feedback on. Otherwise, feedback becomes very sort of blurred and vague. It's like, oh, you did well. Whereas if I know that my coaching point is, when you're striking a ball, you got to hit it with your laces. You got to put, I'm doing a really crap example of football here, but you got to put your standing foot next to the ball, head over the ball. They're my coaching points. So when I'm giving feedback, I can say, great, Johnny, you put your head over the ball, you hit it with your laces. Next time, can we just make sure that standing foot's close to the ball? So I'm being very specific to what it is, we're all aware of in the environment, because I've shared my coaching points. I've modeled it. I've said, these are the things we're looking for, folks. And if I can give my feedback against that, we know we're doing a good job. If I've omitted the coaching points and the students, the coaches, whatever you want to call them, are not aware of them, any feedback is, likely to be ineffectual. So that's my little tip on feedback. I don't know if it's any good.
No, that's great. That's fantastic. So I know at the minute you're doing still working towards your PhD. Is that accurate? Yeah. And I've got a vague understanding from bits and bobs of seeing what you're looking at in terms of discourses of skill. But just purely from a personal point of view, I'd be interested to hear a bit more around what you are looking at, what you've been looking at, and maybe any kind of initial thoughts or findings that you've come up with, really.
Okay, yeah, get ready. So the PhD stems from my time in FE, and particularly when I was in quality roles. And at one college, we had this, it was a 16-point employability framework that all teachers had to sort of embed in their practice in some way, because obviously we're trying to make learners employable. You go again, like at the heart of it, there's a real, meaningful thing, but it just never quite felt right to me. It's another, it reminds me of learning styles anyway. And so I'd be going around the college like going, oh, how have you implemented any of this stuff from the 16-point employability thing into your planning? Oh, well, I've put teamwork on my scheme of work, and that's when they're doing a group activity. It's like, yeah, I mean, what would I do? And I sort of started thinking, like, what would I do for all these? And some of them, these employability skills that were on this list, they weren't even what I'd call skills. There was things like confidence on there and resilience. And I was like, I'm a bit at a loss here. I don't know how I'd do it. So how can I therefore support others? And so this sort of feeling never went away. And of course, when I came to the university, it's still there, and it still really annoyed me, because it was, it's pushed on a lot of FE colleges to develop these wider skills and attributes or whatever for the learners. And I think, again, the meaning behind it is a good one. So I then wanted to explore, why is there this sort of fetish, I called it, with generic and transferable skills, or 21st century skills, or employability skills, or keys. And they've got all sorts of names if you look through the literature over the years, and they've not really changed a great deal. You get the same sort of stuff: problem solving, teamwork, communication, all the stuff we're still seeing now, even if it's rebranded into the institution's own ways of looking at them. And so I started my PhD with a philosophical inquiry. So spent a lot of time reading about the philosophy of skill. And it's quite interesting to me. It won't be to you, but the idea is that, we've got this sort of common language for skill that has existed for time, generally that it's sort of something that tends to be practically based. It's something that involves the technique, but isn't the technique on its own. It might involve decision making, and fundamentally it's subject to what they call normative appraisal. So normative appraisal is like, Johnny can do X skillfully, whereas with knowledge you don't have that normative appraisal. So you go, Johnny knows the capital of France really well. Well, you either know it or you don't. So that's the difference between like sort of declarative knowledge and skills, is that the skills tend to be subject to that normativity. So yeah, did a bit of that. started reading Chris Winch's work, which is really interesting if you're in technical or vocational education. And he talks about how the term skill has become inflated beyond its original conception. And so there's some of that inflation, he says, which is quite okay. You can understand it. So like mental arithmetic or like basic skills, mental arithmetic, you can sort of apply the same premise philosophically to that. But then there's some that have just got a bit too inflated, and he calls that immoderate inflation. And so things like general skills like problem solving, he says, are really problematic because actually you have to add new knowledge and new skills to be a good problem solver in a different domain. So I always give the example of like, you know, if you gave me someone's diet and said, right, Dan, solve the issue with this, you know, figure out what they're doing wrong. And yeah, it's been a while since I've looked at that sort of stuff, but my subject knowledge and background in fitness and stuff should allow me to solve the issue for that individual. But if you said to me, Dan, now go and apply your problem solving skills to my car that's just broke down on the side of the road, I haven't got a Scooby. I don't know. I would not know where to start. And so that idea that they can be transferred is problematic. And, you know, I need new knowledge. I need new ideas and things to be able to allow me to do that. So that's one problem with this inflation. And then inflation of what they call like social skills is that, you know, we can teach people to be good communicators. Well, that's really, really fraught with issues. Just think about the fact that communications normally involves more than one person. So if you're teaching me to do something, it takes away all agency from the person I'm doing that with. So I'll give you an example. Like empathy is one that's bandied around a lot now. I'm terrible for empathy because I've not experienced it. I can't. But you know, if you were teaching me to be empathetic, all you're teaching me to do is act empathetic, because I haven't necessarily had your life experiences and stuff. So if I'm acting empathetic and oh poor thing, pat on the head and all that sort of stuff, I'm actually manipulating you. It's really unethical when you think about it like that. To teach someone to be empathetic is teaching them to manipulate others, and it's problematic. So anyway, I've waffled on again, but I was really interested in the philosophy, and then I started exploring like social perspectives of skills. So the way that society says that if you've got a high level qualification, you're more skilled. You know, qualifications are used as proxies for skill, and it's like, well, that's not always the case, is it? Because you know, you've got bloody skilled construction workers working on a construction site who might not have qualifications above a certain level, but you're saying just because I've got a level 7, I'm more skilled than that. It's really debatable. So that was really interesting avenue. So I've done a bit of literature review around that. And then, as you mentioned at the start, discourses of skill. So discourse is basically the way we communicate ideas. I'm really interested in the way that the government views skills and communicates that through policy, and the way that we as practitioners interpret that and then communicate that to our learners. And so I'm finding lots of stuff at the minute, and you know, I'm 4 years in, excuse the ring doorbell going off in the background. I'm 4 years in, I have findings, I'm analysing it, but it's just not quite clear yet. I always tell people it's like I've got a pair of glasses on that have like steamed up, and I'm starting to wipe it away, but the edges are still a bit steamed up. So you forgive me for not going on any further, but I'm sure you don't really want to hear me waffle on anymore anyway about that.
No, it'd be great to hear some more kind of as you make a bit more progress with that. But that sounds genuinely really interesting. So we've got a couple of minutes left. So I thought a good idea was to finish with kind of a bit of a quick fire round. So a couple of things from me. So for you, off the top of your head, kind of 3 fundamentals for successful teaching and or coaching.
Okay. I had to think about this beforehand. It's really hard when you narrow it down to 3. But fundamentally, I've got know your environment and your sort of when I say environment, like sort of what you can do within that environment. So how you apply your routines. So if we're out on the field, where are my coachees, whatever you want to call them, students, learners, where are they coming to, where are they going to stand when they arrive at that place? How am I going to transition between activities in that environment? So it's that knowledge of your environment. Same applies in the classroom. Know your classroom. Am I greeting the students at the door? Am I doing seating plans? And so I think whatever it is you approach with that environment, so whatever approach you take, I think you have to be consistent with. You have to establish a routine, habits, create that habit formation, because as soon as you don't, you start opening yourself up to all sorts of issues with low-level behavior, low-level disruption. So that's one. Tell me if you've got any questions that you want to probe further. Second one, know your students. That's an obvious one, isn't it? But I talked earlier about the importance of initial assessment, and just knowing your students inside out, back to front can help no end with that, because you find out, okay, not only what they know, but what kind of things they like and things they're aware of beyond the subject, which can help you connect new knowledge to, or new ideas to. So, you know, we use metaphors and analogies all the time in our language, and so if I can relate things to what they already know, it's going to make my life so much easier. It's going to help them as well. So knowing your students, and you know, the most important one, I suppose, as a teacher, trainer, coach, and people might not agree with it, is just know your subject inside out and back to front, because the more confident you are with your subject, the more confident you can be teaching that, supporting your students, or you know, in any capacity, but also not being you know, it allows you to go off grid a little bit, because you don't worry about not knowing, because you do know. So knowing your subject inside out is really important, and just helps you to structure it. You know, if I'm coaching out on the field, again, bad examples coming your way because I've not done it for a while, but I know, if I know the sport and the way to develop skills sequentially over a period of time, it's going to help me no end than just coming in and doing like random stuff that has no apparent link to what they've learned before and where they're going and so forth. So yeah, that's me.
What advice would you give to Dan, who was just starting out? If I could take you back, or I guess advice to anyone just starting out, teachers, coaches. What's there maybe that like golden nugget that you could give to them?
Okay, this one, I think back to my time in my first 2 years as a teacher, I was terrible. I'm not gonna lie, I got it all wrong, and I think that was largely because I graduated, went straight into teaching without my qualification, so I did it in service, and I was quite young and I was naive and I was not too far off the age I was teaching, and so I really messed up the professional boundaries. Didn't get that right. I'm not saying I did anything particularly bad here, just let's put that one out there, but I treated the students, I think, more like friends than students, and that was fine to win them over, and we had, you know, good laugh in the classroom, which everyone thinks is a great thing, and it goes some way to helping you to engage them, until there comes a point where you need to start, let's say, cracking the whip, for want of a better phrase, and then I had, you know, I lost all respect of the students, and yeah, I really struggled because of that. So my advice would be, there's, sorry to say this, there's an adage in education that don't smile to Christmas. Now there's something in that, not that you shouldn't smile as soon as you greet your students, that's wrong, but there's certainly something in that, sort of maintaining high expectations and clear professional boundaries, because if you don't do it from the start, the expectations, the boundaries naturally sort of, not slip, that's a wrong way to put it, but they, you know, as you've spent a year with someone, what started out at the beginning changes, your relationship with them changes, and so go in high, with your expectations, with your boundaries, and try and keep consistent for as long as you can. So yeah, that was a big lesson for me. And slightly off topic, when I then tried to like remediate this issue, I went the complete opposite end of the scale, and I went super hardcore on them. And I think to some extent that did help with low level disruption, but also made me appear very cold to my students. And so I was like quite robotic, and and they didn't see my personality. So hopefully since then I found a more of a happy medium. But yeah, you got to experience it yourself, I suppose. But professional boundaries, always have them in mind. And my only other thing that I'd advise people of, particularly a young Dan who always liked to please everyone, as be on side, get good feedback from people, is that you can't please everyone all of the time. And that is a bitter pill to swallow. But you're dealing with, particularly yourself, Dex, in your sector, you're dealing with potentially hundreds of young people a week. And if there's only one or two in there that are, oh, that Dexter's a bit of an idiot, whatever, I think you're winning. You're not going to have all 100 of them on side. And so, you can please the vast majority, but there'll always be some you can't. And don't take it personally if you're not. And that's something I think that I certainly took a long time to get over. I would take it home with me and be like, oh, why is so-and-so really not, giving me bad feedback or said something? And I think that's important for everyone to remember. No matter how wonderful you are, there'll be someone who just doesn't get it, and that's fine.
And finally, from me, is there any recommendations for someone you think I should look to speak to, someone we should look to get on the podcast in the future at all?
Well, I think I'm really interested in your principal. I think she'd be a great acquisition if you could get Jo on. I think she's got loads of amazing stories to tell, no doubt. And so I would recommend Jo. A good friend of mine who is the the exact title escapes me, but it's like Chief Operations Director for SCL, Stuart Allen. I think I would recommend he comes on your podcast. And these are two quite senior leaders in the sector, so in the FE sector. So I'm coming at it. I'm not that au fait with who's a great coach in the area. So I'm coming at it with an FE eye here. So I'll just be clear on that. So they're two very good leaders in the sector, both with a background in sport and coaching, who I think would offer a lot to a podcast. And if we're talking a sort of more practitioner level in FE, again, I'm sorry, a bit lame there. I would suggest Lindsay Wilson, who's at Nottingham College, and Mike Tyler, who's at a college in Birmingham, but I'm sure you follow him on Twitter anyway. But he's got a lot of really interesting things to say, and as has Lindsay. And they approach things slightly differently, both again from sport backgrounds. So that's all I've got for you, mate.
No, that's great, Dan. Honestly, I just want to say thank you. As I said at the very top of it, this is the first episode, and the first kind of crack at this. So I appreciate your time and willingness to get involved for me, and it's been good to catch up and see you again, and hopefully we'll do again at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks for inviting me as your first guest. That's like a real honor. I wish you all the best with it, because I think these sorts of things are great, and it was challenging. I'm not going to lie, puts you on the spot, and that's, I think that brings the best out of people, even if it is a load of waffle. You're sort of helping me collect my thoughts as you're challenging me with my questions. And yeah, I think there is a lot to learn across the sectors, like you said, between coaching and teaching and instructing and things. And so hopefully if you get a diversity of speakers, it'd be really interesting to learn from others, because I'm always keen to learn from others. So yeah, thank you very much for your invite.
Thank you for listening to the first episode of Podagogy, the teaching and coaching podcast. Another thank you to Dan for joining me today. You can find Dan on Twitter at furtheredagogy, and you can also find and follow the podcast at Podagogy Podcast. Thank you again, and goodbye.